Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another forecast discussion. Our much anticipated severe weather event is on our doorstep starting today, Wednesday, February 15th, and going into tomorrow, Thursday, February 16th. We've seen an upgrade in the risk for a lot of these regions that are under the gun for these next couple days. For today, we have an enhanced risk, level 3 out of 5, for parts of eastern Arkansas into northwest Mississippi and western Tennessee, surrounded by a large slight risk that extends all the way back into southeast Oklahoma, northeast and east Texas, and into the northern half of Louisiana. All hazards on the table for today. The enhanced risk area is coincident with a 10% hashed area for significant tornado centered kind of right on the Mississippi River Delta there from Greenville up toward Memphis and vicinity. Damaging winds also going to be a threat today, greatest threat within the enhanced risk area there, as well as the threat for large hail, significant large hail, especially there along the dryline out to the east, just to the north of Dallas, kind of straddling the Red River there, places like Ardmore and Durant, Oklahoma, along with that tornado threat that does extend farther back into southeast Oklahoma and northeast Texas as well. Then we go into tomorrow. The severe threat will continue all the way from the Gulf Coast states, Mississippi and Alabama, up into the Great Lakes region. We do have a large, narrow but large enhanced risk area centered on eastern Mississippi, western Alabama, up through central Tennessee, central Kentucky, into southeast Indiana, and western Ohio. Tornado threat is apparent tomorrow. We do have a 10% hashed area once again for that corridor from eastern Mississippi into western Alabama, including places like Birmingham and Tuscaloosa. Damaging winds are a threat, as does the tornado threat does extend all the way up to the north as well, including places like Louisville and Cincinnati, 5% up there, as well as a damaging wind threat. That will be a significant threat tomorrow, that 30% area coincident with the enhanced risk region. Hail, not going to be a super big threat tomorrow. The greatest threat will be with any discrete supercells down there in the enhanced risk portion, the portion of the enhanced risk coincident with that 10% hashed area. Threat for discrete warm sector supercells is apparent there. So those would have the best chance of producing hail, although I think the main threats tomorrow are going to be tornadoes and damaging wind. So we have a lot to talk about. Let's go ahead and dive right in. We're going to start off, of course, talking about today's threat going into tonight, and then we'll talk about the continuation of the threat tomorrow in the latter half of the video. So let's go ahead and dive in. We'll take a look, as we always do, first at our water vapor satellite imagery, and kind of pops right off the page. Big old swirl here, centered right over the Four Corners region there in the desert southwest. And that is our main trough that is going to be our big player for severe weather today. You can see kind of a broad fetch of southwesterly flow to the east of that trough. Just a pretty looking trough here moving into the central and southern plains as we go into the next couple of days. Visible satellite imagery, pretty interesting setup here that we see. Some cloud cover across much of the eastern and southern portions of Texas. We have quite a bit of clearing ongoing out here across Oklahoma into north central Texas. That is going to be important for today in aiding the erosion of the cap that is in place across this region. We'll talk about that, of course, more in a little bit. Clouds do extend out here up into the southeast states, up into Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. Enough breaks in the clouds, though, to potentially help destabilize the atmosphere as we go through the day today. Let's look at our upper air maps. This is at 500 millibars, about 18,000 feet above ground. And you can see that big old trough centered over the Four Corners vicinity. Very strong flow rounding the base of this trough. And this will continue to move off toward the east or northeast as we go into the afternoon and evening hours today. Now, this is not going to be I guess you could call it classic progression of this trough. What's going to happen is, you can see it looks pretty solid now, but what's going to happen as we go through the next couple of days is it's actually going to take on a much more positive tilt. It's going to kind of shear out, meaning it's going to look much more positively tilted with time. There's not going to be a well-defined exit region. And these are not quite as favorable for severe weather. Usually we like to see a real tightly wound negative tilt trough where the axis kind of tilts back toward the left. In this case, we're going to take on a much more positive tilt with this particular trough. It looks fairly neutrally tilted to maybe slightly positively tilted now, but it's going to get sheared out, and we'll take a look at the models here in a little bit, and the axis of this trough is going to look something like that, which is very much a positively tilted trough. Now, that's not to say we can't have severe weather with positively tilted troughs. We've seen plenty of significant events in the past that have dealt with a positively tilted trough. But generally, you want to see that more neutrally or negatively tilted trough because you have a much more well-defined exit region, much stronger sort of vorticity advection or spin, much more favorable ingredients, so to speak, in the exit region of that trough. that are much more conducive to severe weather. With a positively tilted trough, it's just kind of sheared out. It's you don't have a well-defined exit region, not as many favorable ingredients there in that exit region for severe weather. So that's going to be the case with this particular trough, and that is going to have implications on the overall severe threat over the next couple of days. But this trough, for the next day or so, going to continue to move off toward the east or northeast, and we should see a glancing influence, at least in this particular region here, for today's event. Now, it's not going to move very fast, so this region out in here, this enhanced risk portion, is going to be well removed from this particular trough. And we'll show you on the models here in a second. We actually have a little bit, you can see a little bit of ridging aloft here in the height contours, just a tad bit, and that's going to hang around for much of the day. And we'll show you on the models how that might have a little bit of an implication in the overall severe threat. It should stay pretty quiet throughout the day, and that means that warm advection is going to have to fuel these storms out here in that enhanced risk region tonight. Let's go down to 850 millibars. We'll take a look at our low-level jet. You can see we've already had a pretty decent mass response, low-level response from this particular trough traversing the Rockies. Some plume of low-level jet there across the western half of Texas. That's going to expand into Oklahoma, East Texas, into the southeast states as we go through the afternoon and evening today, as we'll have this continue to consolidate and move off toward the east. And we know what the low-level jet does. Helps to, number one, pull that low-level moisture northward very efficiently, and number two, helps increase that low-level shear for potential supercells with all hazards in this particular event. So that's going to be something to watch as we go through the day. We should have a pretty strong low-level jet, given fairly decent low-level response from this particular trough. Let's go down to the surface, take a look at what's going on now. You can see a couple of different low centers, one up here in southwest Colorado, and that is pretty tightly wound surface low up there. We also are seeing surface low development out here across the western portion of Mexico. That's going to be our main surface low that will move off toward the northeast today and really kind of consolidate as we go on in the next several hours today. And that, of course, will help the winds in the warm sector back and strengthen a little bit and really help pump that low-level moisture northward with time. Now, the moisture return with this particular system, especially for today's event, was expected to be a little bit on the iffy side. We were not sure how far north that moisture would get and how soon it would get farther north. And some of the models were showing a pretty paltry moisture return with this particular portion of the event, today's portion of the event. Well, let's take a look at some surface data now and look where that moisture is. And you can see here, recording this just before 9 a.m. Central Standard Time, we already have 60s dew points well into Texas. You can see our 60s dew point line kind of somewhere in this vicinity there. So 60s dew points well inland at this point. A lot of the models previously were showing that those 60s and 70s dew points were going to be hanging out here near the coast, down into the Gulf even, but we've seen much more robust moisture return by this point. And that means we should have no issues getting this moisture northward into the southern Oklahoma, southeast Oklahoma vicinity for this evening. And that will be the same out toward the east. We already have 60s dew points up into southern Arkansas. So let's shift our sector a little bit. 60s dew points all the way up into southern Arkansas, and that again should continue to shift northward with time. Going to be more of a shift and transport northward there in this western portion of the risk area, closer to that surface low. We still should see some northward advance of this warm front out to the east as well. So, the last couple of days, in our last video, we talked about the moisture return maybe just in time. We were kind of watching this and not sure if this would be enough moisture return, in the daytime hours at least, for robust severe storm development. Well, that's looking less likely now. It's looking more likely that we're going to see robust storm development because we have strong warm moist advection ongoing, and those favorable dew points are already well inland here across the southern portion of the U.S. Couple of features to note. We do have a cold front that is draped somewhere right in this vicinity. You can see the wind shift, winds to the northeast, to the north of that boundary, winds out of the east or southeast to the south of the boundary. That is a cold front draped from a surface low that is well up here toward the northeast out of the picture. And that surface low down here in western Mexico going to consolidate, kind of ride up that frontal zone as we go through today, and that will be our main player for severe storms and the main focus, the main use for this particular front in this case. Now we'll also see, as that low translates northeastward and strengthens, a development of a dry line. You can already see some some of that dry line in place. Very dry air out here at the surface across West Texas. Marfa, dew point of 8, Fort Stockton, dew point of 5, whereas we have much more moist air to the east. So dry line setting up somewhere in here at this point. As that low moves off toward the east or northeast, that will continue to consolidate. We should have very well-defined dry line somewhere in this vicinity by late afternoon or so. And that will be our main impetus for severe storm development late this afternoon and evening across this particular portion of the event. So that is going to be the Texas portion of the event. Let's take a look at some soundings now. We'll start here at Dallas-Fort Worth, 12Z sounding. You can see we're definitely well north of that marine warm front, well north of the best moisture, so this is not going to be representative of the overall warm sector at this point. We do see a plume of very steep lapse rates aloft, though, remnants of that elevated mixed layer. We talk about the EML always here on the channel, that layer of warm, dry air at the surface. On the higher terrain of the desert southwest, gets transported across into our target area above our moist layer in the low levels. That helps to cap the atmosphere and let instability build throughout the day. Now let's take a look at a sounding that's more representative of our warm sector. This is at Brownsville this morning. Moist layer fairly shallow. I do think that will deepen with time today as we get continued low-level warm moist advection, but for now very shallow moisture there in the low levels. You can see that steep lapse rate plume indicative of the elevated mixed layer here at Brownsville. So that's going to help cap things and keep the warm sector pretty quiet today, let that moisture return unsullied, and then allow for storm development later on this evening. Let's take a look a little bit farther to the east at Lake Charles. You can see a little bit deeper of a moist layer there extending up above 850 millibars. Lots of dry air there aloft, though, you can see in the mid-levels. That'll be interesting to note, and that may be something to watch with those storms later on. We know that dry air entrainment can actually favor more downdraft formation, keep updrafts a little bit less robust, a little bit skinnier. So we'll have to watch that for sure. Perhaps we'll get some moistening here in the mid-levels as we go through the day today as that trough moves in. So I'm not too concerned with that at this point, but we should keep that in mind for sure. Here's Shreveport, once again, north. This is in the better moisture, but very shallow moisture with northward extent. Again, I do think that moisture will deepen as we go through the day today. So let's take a look at some model data. This is going to be the 12Z NAM, and now that we're at the day of the event, the models are going to be much more in agreement, and they are. So we're just going to look at the NAM for this particular video, the NAM that is coming in right now. So 500 millibars here to start. Initializing that trough out here to the west pretty well. Very strong flow rounding the base of that trough. Moves off toward the east or northeast, but watch what happens as we go through the day today. It's going to move off toward the east, but it's going to start shearing out as we go into the evening. It starts taking on a much more positive tilt with time, and we talked about that. You know, this is, and as far as this particular region goes, east of the dry line here, we're just going to kind of get a glancing blow from the forcing. So that can do a couple of things. We've talked about the impacts of the positive tilt trough on the overall severe threat, but because we're seeing kind of glancing forcing with this particular setup in at least the Texas portion of this region, we may see a little bit better tendency for storms to stay discrete as they fire along the dry line this afternoon. So that may increase the threat for tornadoes and large hail, at least in the first few hours of storm development. So let's take a look farther out toward the east here in our enhanced risk area. We talked about that little bit of ridging aloft, and it's going to stick around quite a bit as we go through the day today. Look at that ridging across Arkansas, for example. You see a little bit of kink of a inverse kink, if you will, in the height contours there. But watch this particular line. This is the 5700 line right here. It's actually going to rise a little bit off toward the north with time. You can see right in there, it rises off a little bit to the north. So that means we're going to see at least neutral to potentially rising heights across the region. And we want to see height falls. We want to see those heights fall. That helps to initiate rising motion across the area of interest and is much more favorable for storm formation. So we're not going to be really dealing with synoptic ascent in this particular region. Therefore, warm advection is going to be our main driver for storms out here in the open warm sector, well away from our 500 millibar trough and surface low. So that's something to keep in mind. That ridging is going to stick around for a while, and then after dark, finally, as we go into the early morning hours tomorrow, that trough finally starts to move in, and that will be a little bit better for robust storm coverage, at least with this particular setup going into the morning hours tomorrow. Let's go down to 700 millibars. When you don't have synoptic scale ascent like that, at least with the general wave pattern, we try to look for these short waves moving through little kinks in the flow, rotating around the main waves that may be more localized areas of lift and other favorable severe weather ingredients. So this is at 700 millibars. This is at 21Z 3 p.m. About 0Z here. A little bit of shortwave development out in here. Kind of extending back in here, kind of just an area of stronger winds there at 700 millibars. So that may help that particular area near the dry line. But out toward the east, notice here about 3 to 6Z. You'll see a little bit of a kink there in the flow. That rotates through a little bit, and you'll notice that it's kind of right over Arkansas here by midnight tonight. Little subtle shortwave there. That may be just enough to aid in storm formation here, along with the warm advection regime out there across the enhanced risk area. Again, we're kind of removed from the overall synoptic scale forcing and the overall surface low out here. So we're going to need some sort of shortwave, some sort of confluence in the low levels, and we'll look at that in a second, to aid storm formation in that warm advection regime tonight. Let's look at 850 millibars. Take a look at our low-level jet. You see that little plume across West Texas at the moment, as initialized by the NAM run here. Low-level jet moves off toward the east. We continue to get consolidation of that low-level cyclone. By about 3 p.m., we see a nice plume of low-level jet there extending from the eastern half of Oklahoma into East Texas, Louisiana, southern Arkansas. That is definitely favorable for severe weather there. It sticks around through the evening hours, and storms that fire along the dry line should be able to feed on that stronger low-level shear there for a potential tornado and hail threat. That low-level jet shifts off toward the east as we go into the overnight hours, and very strong low-level jet ramp up there across the Mississippi River Delta region, western Tennessee, eastern Arkansas by 9Z. This is 3 a.m. Tomorrow morning, and again, storms will be ongoing here. This may increase the overall coverage of storms, may also increase the intensity given much stronger low-level shear with time in that region. Let's go down to the surface here. Once again, we'll talk about Thursday, tomorrow's threat, in a second, but I want to really hone in on this particular, on today's threat. So we'll go to our southern plains sector here, and let's start off with moisture. And you can see that we've initialized the moisture pretty nicely here, those 60 dew points well inland, and that was not the case with several of the past model runs. We'll go to a couple days ago, the 12Z NAM from the 13th of February. Notice where it has that moisture, those 60 dew points, the blue colors there, all the way down, hugging the coastal region there across southeast Texas. Whereas now we're seeing moisture, as we saw on our observed data, much farther inland. So again, not going to be an issue now. This was expected to be an issue a couple days ago, this overall just-in-time moisture and moisture return. Not going to be an issue at all, given our surface low that will continue to consolidate and move off toward the northeast, strengthening flow in the low levels there. This moisture will really continue to get pulled northward over the afternoon hours today. We have 60 dew points up to the Red River by 21Z, 3 p.m. today. So that's not going to be an issue. And you can see a strengthening dry line there across the region. Strong convergence along that dry line. Notice winds to the west of the boundary out pretty much westerly, with southerly or southeasterly winds to the south or to the east side of that dry line boundary. So strong convergence along that boundary. That's going to be our main initiating mechanism for this portion of the risk area up into southern Oklahoma. So again, moisture returns very nicely, very far into southern Oklahoma by 0Z, 6 p.m. So we should have storms ongoing at this point. Dryline continues to provide strong convergence for storm development. And that's going to be our first bout of storms with this particular event. Convergence along the dryline, the approaching forcing from the upper level trough will allow storms to fire here in the southern Oklahoma to north central Texas vicinity. And where that dry line sets up is still a little bit in question. Right now, the models have it just west of the I-35 corridor. Here's Ardmore, Oklahoma. Here's Dallas-Fort Worth. So just west of the I-35 corridor, Nocona, Decatur, Weatherford, Texas, somewhere in that vicinity, and they will move off toward the east pretty quickly. Let's look at our storm mode we talked about the kind of weaker forcing across this region, potentially favoring discrete storms. Let's look at our our shear vectors with respect to the initiating boundary. There's our dry line. Notice our shear vectors very much perpendicular to that initiating boundary. So we should have a very nice window for discrete storm formation, especially with southern extent initially as that moisture continues to surge northward and then into Oklahoma as we go towards sunset. But discrete storms should fire here first along this dry line, and we should have a pretty solid window for those storms to stay discrete with all hazards. That's, again, going to increase the overall threat for tornadoes and large hail as those storms stay discrete. So now let's take a look at some soundings across this particular region. I want to take a look at 21Z. We'll take a look here. Let's actually go to 0Z, and we'll take one here, Dallas-Fort Worth, and one closer to the Durant, Oklahoma area. So again, this is about 6 p.m. or so. And actually, let's do one here at 4 p.m. I want to take one out in here across this region. You'll notice that little blob there of weaker dew points. I'm not sure exactly what that is. I don't know if that's really legitimate. Could be a model quirk. So in this particular NAM sounding, that capping inversion you can see is hanging around pretty significantly there into the afternoon hours. But look at the surface temperatures, 64 degrees here at the surface. That is way, way underdone. I really don't believe that at all. If we look at our surface data, again, of course, right now we're still north of the warm front. We're already seeing temperatures in the mid to upper 60s down here in the warm sector. With continued surface heating, as we saw through the morning into the afternoon hours, that temperature should rise pretty significantly into at least the low to mid 70s, I would think. So the NAM is extremely underdoing these surface temperatures here. So if we were to say we had a temperature of maybe 74 degrees, 10 degrees higher, our temperature profile would be somewhere in here, and it would look something like that. If we were to do our sounding analysis here, finding our parcel trace, if you're unfamiliar with that, head over to my SKU-T series, but it would look something like this, meaning we have much more robust instability in the deep layer and much less of that capping inversion that would be evident on our sounding. So again, this particular model run, the NAM, and the NAM, as we know, is notorious for underdoing surface temperatures. This particular model run is really underdoing surface temperatures. I think temperatures are really going to get into the low to mid 70s, and as a result, that capping inversion that we talked about a little bit in the previous video, not going to be as much of a concern now, given strong convergence along the dry line, glancing forcing from that upper trough, and much warmer temperatures here with strong surface heating. Should not be an issue getting storms to fire along the dry line, probably as early as maybe 4 p.m. or so this evening across the North Texas to southern Oklahoma vicinity, and then they will increase in intensity as that moisture continues to surge northward overnight here. This is going to be at 3Z. We'll take a sounding out here out ahead of these storms right along the Red River. This is at 0Z. First of all, you can see Dallas, and we see even with the lower surface temperatures here at 0Z, 70 degrees in Dallas, we do have a fairly destabilized atmosphere. That capping inversion has eroded pretty much fully, and we would expect again to see a little bit warmer temperatures than this. So the capping shouldn't be too much of an issue with this particular event, as maybe it was expected to be a couple days ago. But strong deep layer instability, mixed layer CAPE about 1,800 joules per kilogram, with very favorable looking hodographs. Strong deep layer shear, 55 knots of effective bulk shear there. Long hodographs with large looping hodographs in the low levels, indicative of the strong veering of those low level winds with height. So given we have those kind of hodographs and a fairly favorable discrete storm mode, would expect to see a tornado threat with these storms, especially as we go towards sunset as that moisture continues to increase across this region, as well as a large hail threat. Pretty decent moderate instability there, with a very discrete storm mode and a deep layer shear that favors strong rotating updrafts. Would expect to see large hail and perhaps some significant hail across this region as well. Up to the north near Ardmore, same thing. Again, surface temperatures much too cool there. So we should get instability up into the 1,500 to 2,000 joules per kilogram range, and amidst these very favorable hodographs. All hazards definitely on the table with this initial round. So this is going to be our initial round. You can see by 3Z, we do see a very much destabilized profile. Mixed layer CAPE here exceeding 2,500 joules per kilogram on this particular run at 3Z, 9 p.m. Central Standard Time. Strong low-level instability as well, with a very favorable looking hodograph for tornadic supercells, potentially with the other hazards as well. So we definitely seen an uptick in the severe threat along this dry line for sure, relative to what the models were showing a couple days ago, thanks to this more robust moisture return and much more robust looking dry line. So this will be our first round. Storms will first fire here along the dry line. We also need to watch out here potentially eastern Texas into Louisiana. We may be able to see some warm advection stuff fire out here. Again, the capping inversion will be a little bit stronger out here because we're a little bit farther removed from the overall upper trough. That will help to erode that cap. We're kind of those clouds may stick around out here a little bit longer as well, so we may not have it as robust erosion of that cap. But by 0Z, you can see a fairly destabilized profile, a little bit of that capping inversion left, but a favorable profile for supercells with all hazards out there as well. So need to watch that area for warm advection stuff. This is much more conditional out here. Places like Lufkin, Nacogdoches, up towards Shreveport and western Louisiana. Need to keep that in mind. Again, I think very conditional at this point. Much more favorable, much more likely storm initiation along that dry line this evening, but we'll have to keep that in mind tonight as well. Then we shift to the eastern portion of the risk area. We should see storms start to fire in that warm advection regime as we go into the overnight hours. This is going to be an after dark threat. That moisture continues to surge northward, and that will be the main impetus for storm development here out in the open warm sector. We are expecting some sort of prefrontal confluence here. It's hard to see it on the surface map. You can't really see it on the surface map here. If we go to 850, I would expect to see maybe some semblance of a little kink in the flow there. So maybe a little bit of ripple in the flow there that may help to initiate storms out across this region. But we are forecasting some sort of prefrontal confluence out in here. Maybe some very slight confluence out in here across southeast Arkansas into northwest Mississippi that will help to initiate storms, more discrete supercells given much weaker forcing out here in the open warm sector. And we shouldn't have an issue as far as kinematics go. The moisture return, well to the north, our warm front is kind of up in this vicinity here. That moisture return, not an issue. But here's our profile. A little bit less instability, maybe a little bit more capping inversion hanging around. We'll have to watch that as well because we're, again, a little bit farther removed from the overall synoptic forcing and the stronger heating, surface heating throughout the day. We may see that cap stick around a little bit. So whether or not these storms will be surface-based out here in the open warm sector is a little bit in question, but we do know that a strong low-level shear can add to the buoyancy and help burst through this small bit of capping inversion. Still very favorable photographs out here. Very strong looping of those clockwise curvature of those photographs in the low levels, veering of those winds with height in the low levels of the atmosphere amid strong deep layer shear would favor a tornado threat, perhaps strong tornado threat with any of those storms out in the open warm sector if they can become surface-based. That's a big if. Little bit of capping inversion may stick around there, but we'll have to watch that for sure. That's very marginal looking. May not have too much of an impact, but we'll have to see. And if those storms do become surface-based, all hazards are on the table with those storms. So those storms out in the Texas, Oklahoma portion of the outlook will start to take on a more linear organization as that cold front catches up. That low shifts off toward the east pretty quickly, becomes more progressive. Much stronger forcing there as we go into the overnight hours and early morning hours tomorrow. Should have a line of storms form along this frontal zone with more of a damaging wind and embedded tornado threat as well. Now we go into the Thursday portion of the event. Let's back out here to the 500 millibar map. So as we go through the overnight hours into tomorrow, you can see that trough really shears out. Very much positively tilted at this point. This is 3 p.m. Thursday. We are noticing a little bit of somewhat of a shortwave maybe perhaps in the flow there, coupled with this very strong 500 millibar flow out just ahead in the exit region of this trough. So that may allow for some significant severe weather up here to the north, all the way up here into Indiana and Ohio, up into the Great Lakes vicinity there. Down farther to the south, you'll notice we kind of have this dual jet structure. We've talked about this before, particularly in events like December 10th, 2021. Again, not comparing this event at all to that. We've seen this dual jet structure before. You have your main jet, but you also have this plume just to the south that provides kind of just broad southwesterly flow across the region. And so the southern portion of the event, the forcing may be a little bit weaker. We may see a little bit more discrete storm development out here in the open warm sector with southern extent down into Louisiana, Mississippi, and western Alabama, whereas we have much stronger forcing up here, much greater tendency, I think, up here for storms to be a little bit more linear tomorrow, given such strong forcing. Let's dive into that a little bit more. We'll take a look at the 700 millibar plot, and you'll notice that 700 millibar shortwave moves up into the Midwest there, with maybe a little bit of some kinks in the flow down here in the open warm sector to aid in weaker forcing there for storm initiation tomorrow out in the open warm sector. 850 millibar jet going to be very strong as well. You saw that uptick across the Mississippi River Delta vicinity there overnight tonight. That will stay and keep its strength as we go into tomorrow morning, especially up with northern extent. Very strong low-level jet up here in Indiana and Ohio. That's 60 to 70 knots or so low-level jet up there. Trails down into Mississippi and Alabama, so very strong low-level winds down there as well as we go through the day tomorrow before things really progress off toward the east. So shear should not be an issue. Kinematics will not be an issue tomorrow for these regions. It's going to all depend on storm mode and instability. Let's take a look at our surface pattern. So that surface low located here, this is just after midnight tonight, kind of in the Missouri-Arkansas border vicinity, continues to move off toward the northeast. There's our warm front somewhere in this vicinity, cold front trailing behind that. It will continue to move off toward the northeast. We'll provide a little bit better impetus for storm formation up here to the north, relying on warm advection here to the south as well, and perhaps any prefrontal confluence bands out in there. Let's zoom in and see if we do see any prefrontal confluence out here in the southern portion of the risk area. So again, 10% hashed area is kind of right in here, Mississippi, Alabama vicinity. Not seeing anything really well defined. 18Z, though, we do see some ripples, maybe some small prefrontal trophiness out here ahead of the main frontal zone, which is right in here. So that may be an impetus for warm sector supercells out there tomorrow, which would be more discrete by nature. We do have that warm sector that does kind of pinch off with time, though, but it is wide enough to support maybe some prefrontal storms. We'll take a sounding out in here. And the main concern tomorrow is instability. We're not going to see as robust surface heating as we are today, and we're going to see a lot skinnier instability. And the NAM is usually the model that is more aggressive with instability. A lot skinnier Cape profiles, a little bit of an inversion there. If we do see more robust instability develop, these and warm sector supercells develop, we would see a favorable setup for all hazards, including tornadoes, given large looping hodographs there in the low levels, as well as strong deep layer shear, perhaps some large hail reports in there as well. But it's hard to say. That warm sector does pinch off with time. And let's take another sounding here at 21Z, 3 p.m. tomorrow. Again, storms should be a little bit more linearly organized along the front with some potential for prefrontal discrete development out in here in the warm sector. By 21Z, a little bit of convective contamination, but we do see a little bit better instability by about 3 p.m. or so, mid-afternoon. About 1,000 joules per kilogram of mixed layer Cape. 0 to 3 kilometer Cape is adequate there at about 80 joules per kilogram with large looping hodographs. Strong veering of those low-level winds. Deep layer shear very strong at 55 knots as well. So tornadoes and damaging winds going to be the threat tomorrow, especially as we go into the afternoon. We'll have to watch how the storms progress along the front, how quickly that front progresses off toward the east, and how quickly that warm sector decreases in size. You'll notice as we go into the evening that really starts to pinch off, and the instability gets pinched off and gets shunted down into the Gulf for that particular event. So definitely a little bit more conditional threat, I think, today into the overnight hours. A little bit better threat, a little bit less conditional threat for some significant severe weather. Tomorrow we're going to have to watch and see if we have any prefrontal confluence bands, any of those little prefrontal troughs or confluence there in the open warm sector to aid in storm initiation out in the open warm sector. Let's go up to the north now and take a look at the northern portion of the event. Let's back it up a little bit. So that surface low moves off toward the northeast pretty quickly once again, and that's going to be a very progressive system, very strong forcing associated with this system. So I do think storms will be a little bit more linearly organized up in here. Let's see if we can get the southern portion. So you'll notice that the 60 dew points do extend up pretty far up into Illinois and Indiana. This is at 15Z, so about 9 a.m. tomorrow. Not a very wide warm sector, so the potential for prefrontal stuff out in here is a lot less than it is farther south. But we should have storms fire along this frontal zone here, that pretty progressive frontal zone off toward the east. We'll take a forecast sounding out ahead from far southern Indiana and see what we're seeing in the ingredients there. And we do see a little bit of instability, fairly decent instability, about 1,000 joules per kilogram, 0 to 3 kilometer cape above 100 joules per kilogram. So very strong instability, especially in the low levels. Deep moist layer there as well, extending up almost to 700 millibars. Photographs, a little bit of veering in the low-level winds as that front approaches. That may decrease the overall low-level shear and favorability for tornadic supercells, but would favor perhaps a tornado or two, but mostly damaging winds. As we look at our shear vectors orientation with respect to the boundary, here is our boundary. Let's take a look at our shear vectors here. And I would expect to see a little bit, they are decently perpendicular to the boundary here, as well as in the southern mode tomorrow. So we should see perhaps we may see a window for semi-discrete storms out in here, but again, the overall forcing is super strong. So I would expect maybe a little bit more coverage of storms up in here as well, rather than down here in the open warm sector with much weaker forcing there. So that's something to keep in mind. I'm going to shift sectors once again to kind of see the progression of the overall moisture plume, the overall warm sector, and you can see it gets pinched off really quickly as well as we go into the evening hours. So this is going to be a morning and afternoon, early afternoon event tomorrow across this region. It's going to depend on storm mode up there across the northern portion of the risk area. I do think damaging winds are going to be the main threat up here, given such strong forcing and an overall more linearly organized mode. We could see some semi-discrete elements that would increase the threat for tornadoes, but I think damaging winds is going to be the main threat up there. And then farther to the south, once again, we're going to have to watch for any prefrontal confluence bands and any weak little prefrontal troughs to allow storm formation in the open warm sector. Those would have the threat for some strong tornadoes potentially. Maybe some large hail before shear gets really strong, low-level shear gets really strong, as well as damaging winds both along the front, any storms along the front, and any warm sector storms as well. All right, let's take a look at some cam runs now that we've made our forecast. We're just going to go through the whole event. We'll start off with the HRRR. And so we'll go through. This is the 13Z, recent run of the HRRR. You'll see storms fire about 22Z. That's about 4 p.m. or so, or 4 to 5 p.m. Storms fire there along the dry line, just to the west of the I-35 corridor. Again, here's Windstar Casino right there, Dallas-Fort Worth down in here, Ardmore right in here as well. So just west of the I-35 corridor, storms are going to fire wherever that dry line sets up. Again, the favorability for discrete or semi-discrete storms is there tonight. You can see some more discrete elements here getting stronger as we go into the early evening hours as the low-level jet starts to ramp up. Potential for large, significant hail early on in the life cycle of these storms, as well as some tornadoes. Let's take a quick sounding out in here, just out ahead of these storms, just to see what the HRRR is showing. HRRR's not really showing much in the way of robust instability. Not sure if I completely buy that, given fairly strong warm advection and temperatures being kind of underdone out in here. We'll see what the HRRR is showing out here just after initiation time. A little bit better. 56 dew point. Again, northward extent of the moisture is still a little bit in question, but we do think that it is going to be more robust than was previously expected. So those storms move off to the east with time, and then we start to see this warm advection regime. You see showers out here in East Texas. We'll have to watch those. Again, very conditional whether storms will even fire out here in East Texas. They would have an all-hazards threat. But the main threat is going to be on any prefrontal confluence that can develop out in here, eastern Arkansas, Louisiana, into Mississippi, and western Tennessee. You see storms do start to fire there as we go into the evening hours. When you start to see an increase in coverage as that little shortwave we talked about moves through, warm advection increases. Lots of storms start to fire out here, eastern Arkansas into western Tennessee, with a strong tornado threat as well. Let's go back to our 12Z HRRR and kind of get the overall picture. Let me shift sectors here. So this will go into tomorrow. Warm advection overnight, continues into the morning. Lots of rain and storms out here in the morning. That may sap instability a little bit with the northern mode of this event. And you can see lots of storms start to fire out ahead of the main line here. Perhaps we'll have a strong tornado threat as well. Perhaps some semi-discrete elements up in here as well behind that early morning rain if we can get destabilization, which we should, given that progressive trough, the moving through, destabilizing the atmosphere pretty quickly after that morning rain. We'll have to watch those for a tornado and damaging wind threat, and then things kind of congeal into a mass of storms going into the evening hours on Thursday. Let's go to our WRF ARW model. We'll start out here in our Southern Plains sector. Again, we're using a composite approach, looking at multiple different cams instead of just one, so we can get a composite approach. Storms fire there about 23 to 0Z on the ARW. This is a little late, I think. I don't think storms will take this long to fire. I think by 4 to 5 p.m. or so, we'll see storm initiation there just west of the I-35 corridor there, southern Oklahoma to north central Texas. But this particular model, kind of the same progression. We do see some semi-discrete elements in here, tornado and large hail threat. As those move off toward the east, we do see a number of supercells now firing in the open warm sector after dark, with a tornado, perhaps strong tornado threat there. So very similar progression to what the HRRR was showing. Let me shift off toward the Ohio Valley sector. Same thing in here. Lots of rain and storms in the morning, with some discrete elements out here, Mississippi and Alabama, going into the afternoon hours. Not much up in here. That, again, more conditional up there because of the morning storms. The degree of destabilization is a little bit in question there. With northern extent, but if storms do fire, they will have a tornado and damaging wind threat up there into Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio. One more model we'll take a look at here is the NSSL WRF, and that will be our last cam we look for. So Southern Plains portion of the event tonight, and you can see the WRF does not even fire storms. I really don't think that is going to happen given strong surface heating, models underdoing surface temperatures. I wonder if the surface temperatures are a little low here on this particular model. And yes, we're seeing a plume of 60-degree temperatures up in here. That's just not going to happen, I don't think. So if we see temperatures at 10 to 15 degrees higher than this, we should see storm initiation along the dry line here by late afternoon. That shouldn't be too much of an issue. Along with that glancing blow with the forcing aloft should be enough to erode the cap fully and allow storm initiation here along the dry line. So not really believing this particular run here of the NSSL WRF, but we'll keep looking at it just to see. Does fire storms eventually across southeast Oklahoma, north central Texas in the evening. Warm advection stuff out to the east. Very similar progression. Cold front takes over as we go into tomorrow. Let's shift sectors here. All right, lots of storms there. That warm advection stuff continues, kind of forms an amorphous blob of storms out in here that allows perhaps some questions of destabilization to continue. Warm sector stuff out in Mississippi and Alabama. Not really as robust with this particular run. Not sure I believe that fully. Again, we'll have to watch for instability concerns out in here. If we get a little bit more robust instability than is expected, we should see a higher severe threat for that enhanced risk portion of the event. So that's going to do it for this particular video. Once again, for today, Wednesday, February 15th, we have an enhanced risk, level 3 out of 5, eastern Arkansas, northwest Mississippi, western Tennessee, with a slight risk extending all the way back to the dry line out across the Red River vicinity, including Dallas-Fort Worth and East Texas. Again, first storms to fire today will be along the dry line here, somewhere just west of the I-35 corridor. We'll move off toward the east into the early evening hours with an all-hazards threat, including the threat for significant hail and some tornadoes. Then we'll see the warm advection storms fire up out here across the enhanced risk region after dark, after probably about 8 or 9 p.m. or so, with a strong tornado threat out there and as well as damaging winds. Then we go into tomorrow. Storms will congeal into a cold front, into a more of a line along the cold front overnight, with some semblance, some threat for a discrete warm sector development out in eastern Mississippi and western Alabama. Thus, we have a strong tornado threat there tomorrow, with tornado threat extending up to the north, up into Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio. More of a mostly a damaging wind threat, though. Some threat for hail tomorrow, but again, I think the main threats are tornadoes and damaging winds. Questions about instability remain up in this vicinity with those morning storms. But if we do destabilize, we should see a few storms, perhaps semi-discrete at first before congealing into a line with a tornado and damaging wind threat with northern extent. So a very complex setup here. Lots of folks under the gun with this particular event. But hopefully we nailed down the forecast for you. It's going to be a pretty interesting evolution to this event. We'll see if the strong tornado threat does materialize today and tomorrow. So with that, thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.